I hereby introduce to you Mr. Michael Veazey.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Amazing FBA. Before I go any further, can I just say also, it is now also British Amazon Seller, which is a video podcast, a brand new thing. So if you haven't yet checked that out, if you're listening audio, then go and check it out on video. You always get an extra flavor for the guests when you can see what they're like on camera. And just go to iTunes and look for British Amazon Seller. So today I'm delighted to welcome a new guest to the show, Jeremy Biron, the founder of Forecastly. He's a very impressive guy, been selling on Amazon for over 10 years. So he's got really deep knowledge of the marketplace. He ran a multi-million-dollar wholesale real sale operation there and was one of the first FBA users in the office supply space. So really deep Amazon background. And like the rest of us, he's realized there's a deep need for working out what's going on with forecasting inventory. So Jeremy, you're really needed. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, Michael. Excited to be here. Big fan of the show, and happy to help out.
Thank you. Well, that's very sweet of you. I love your, by the way, in the background in your office, which we'll see in more detail, which says less meetings, get more done. It's so totally suits me. It's the opposite of corporate ways of doing things, right? As entrepreneurs, we've got to get things done, or we live or die by our own actions. So Jeremy, tell us a little bit about your own background. Obviously, I've given the sort of edited highlights, which are very, very impressive CV to have to help other Amazon sellers. But tell us in your own words a bit of how you came to start Forecastly and your whole Amazon journey.
Sure. So coming out of college I think it was about 12 years ago now, 15 years ago, I was working in the corporate world. I was doing marketing and sales and found out pretty quickly that it wasn't for me, and started selling on Amazon part-time while I was doing that, and happened upon office supplies. It's not the sexiest thing, right? But the category worked pretty well for me, and kind of kicked that around for a while, did it part-time, and like a lot of folks that are out there, I realized pretty quickly, hey, I can make more money doing this than I can in my real full-time job, and I enjoy it. Enjoy it a lot more. So I ended up quitting my full-time job and doing this full-time, or doing at that time selling on Amazon full-time. And that was about 10 years ago that I went, 8 years ago that I went full-time. And then about a year and a half, 2 years ago, the office products industry isn't going in the right direction, and I was at a lot of Amazon conferences talking to other FBA sellers, and they would always ask me, you're having a lot of success on FBA, and we are as well, but we keep going out of stock, and we either have a lot of stockouts or we have a lot of excess inventory. And I had the answer, or what was kind of the answer to that, which was some custom-built software that we used in-house. But I knew that that's very different than trying to use software or trying to let hundreds or thousands of sellers use the same software, because it just wasn't built the same way. So at that point I said, all right, I'm ready for my next challenge, right? We're all entrepreneurs, we're ready for a challenge, and said, I'm going to get out of the office products industry and I'm going to go into software. And that's how Forecastly was born. And I don't know, 3 to 6 months later, we launched a beta, and then kind of the rest was history.
Excellent. Well, we'll ask about what that history was in a sec, but again, it's somebody who's come up with a need, like, for example, famously Greg Mercer of Jungle Scout. You hit a need in your own business and solve it. And then, of course, thousands and probably tens of thousands of other people have the same kind of need. So tell us a little about what prompted you to create your custom software. So you talked about going out of stock and excess inventory. So obviously huge problems in general. What were the specific issues that prompted you to actually take action?
Sure. So for me, it was stockouts, just like you said, or it was a combination of stockouts and excess inventory. At the time, we were just using Amazon's reports that you download out of Seller Central, and they say, here's how many you sold in the past, let's just say 30 days. Here's how much inventory you had, and then we were matching it all up. We had some macros built in Excel, and it would be 30 days later after I placed all those orders, or 2 months later, and I would look at my profit and loss and say, hey, it should be a lot more than this. Why are we, why didn't we sell more? And it turns out that our calculations were just off. Taking the data and the reports out of Amazon just wasn't cutting it. And I knew right away, because my background was business. So I had a lot of experience with inventory management, and I had a pretty good idea as far as why it was happening. It's just a matter of trying to make it, trying to fix the problem is not as easy as it sounds.
Yeah, I understand that people take entire degrees in sort of inventory management, and that the whole process is pretty complex. But just backtracking a bit to a couple of things you were saying. First of all, you were trying to use Amazon's back-end reports to deal with inventory. So tell us a bit more about how you tried to do that and what the limitations were.
Definitely. I don't want to get into too much technical details with you and bore everybody, but essentially, a lot of times those aren't accurate, right? The you know to look at your current inventory and what your inbound numbers are, usually the current inventory is right when we're looking at those reports, but not the inbound numbers aren't always accurate. So we didn't know exactly what was coming into Amazon, what status was it in, was it being, when we look at just our existing inventory, is it being labeled? Is it being moved around the country? Is it reserved because it's already been sold? Well, if it's already been sold, if I have 100 units of something and 10% of those units have already been sold, well, I really have 90. So that was, when we just look at existing inventory, that was a big piece of it, including what you have inbound to Amazon. And then the other piece of it is kind of figuring out your sales velocity. That is not as easy of a calculation as a lot of folks think it is. Was the product in stock? So, all right, I sold 50 in the last 30 days. Well, if I don't know if my product was in stock or not that entire period of time, I can't calculate what my true sales velocity is. So if I sold 50 in the last 30 days, but it was out of stock half that time, I should have sold 100. And most of those reports are just saying, yep, you're selling 50 every 30 days. So if you want to buy 30 days worth of inventory, buy another 50.
Excellent. Okay.
And then
the
last piece I was going to say, kind of that, and this is a really important one, is kind of taking that replenishment strategy or that demand forecast, taking the demand forecast and building a replenishment strategy off of it. So when are you going to run out of stock? None of a simple Excel report, even today, is not going to show you what is the likelihood that you're going to have a spike in sales. The only way to do that is to use a database and run some crazy statistical calculations on it. And I knew how to do that with a software database, so I implemented that in our own business.
Wow, that does sound like rocket science, I have to say. Coming back then to the whole question of why this matters. So I think you've touched on two different areas. So let's break that down a little bit. The first one, you mentioned demand forecasting. So presumably that you've got to think about this stuff before you even order your very first product, if you're brand new to Amazon, or if you're on Amazon already selling private label products, which is what we mostly focus on here, but you're ordering some new SKUs, some new products. What is the first thing that you've got to think about there to demand how to work out how to deal with this area?
Sure. So you brought up a very interesting area, and I see a lot of mistakes, and it's tough, right? You're even if you're an experienced private label seller and you're bringing out a new product, you're always thinking, well, how many do I order? A couple very common mistakes, before I go into the mistakes, some of the things you want to think about, right? You want to think about, well, what is the lead time? So how long from the day I tell my supplier that I want to place an order to the day that it actually arrives at Amazon's warehouse? There's a lot of things that have to happen in between there. So let's talk about that a little bit, just to get into some more detail, because this will be helpful, I think. Lead time, you want to consider payment processing, right? You can't just get your money to show up with, let's say, a private label coming out of China. Sometimes it takes a couple days for your payment to process with the bank, and those suppliers won't do anything until that payment processes. Manufacturing time, how long is it really going to take them to manufacture? Is it going to be reliable in terms of the length of time that they quote you? The next thing is shipping time, prepping for shipping. It's not just going to, if you're ordering 1,000 units, unless it's a really, really small item and they can just toss them all in one box, it's going to take a little time to process that shipment. And then see your air time, and then coming into, let's use our example. I guess it doesn't really matter if, let's just say you're in the UK or you're in the US, it still has to go through customs, it has to process. You've seen the delays, I'm sure, and you've heard the horror stories, but yeah, I want to take all that into consideration, and then it's going to land. I'm just using my plane example, but it's going to land at the airport and you have to include time to get to Amazon. It's going to sit on Amazon's dock and then it actually has to get received there. And then if you ship to your own facility, I know a lot of private label sellers are either shipping to their house or their warehouse or a prep facility, a third party. That's all time. Labeling time, bagging, bubble wrap, whatever it is that you do, you want to make sure you take all that into consideration. A lot of folks underestimate their lead time, and it ends up throwing off that entire process. And that's for existing products or for new products.
Yeah, and just come back with a couple of just of my experiences just to underline how important all this stuff is. I mean, the manufacturing time, how long is it really? If you're new to private labeling, let me tell you that what you hear from your manufacturer, and this is probably true everywhere, but certainly my experience in China is that what you hear from your manufacturer may be way more optimistic than the truth. And if they say 2 weeks because you want to hear 2 weeks and that's what they sense, that doesn't mean it's 2 weeks. So you have to look at that with a pinch of salt, I'd say. And the other thing is, do not underestimate two things that have caught me. One is the prep time. If you're sending to a warehouse, for example, if you're based in the UK, which is our primary audience, or not the only one for the podcast, and you're selling in the USA, sometimes it can sit in the dock in a prep center for 3 weeks if you don't go and bully them. And the last thing is, do not underestimate receiving an Amazon time when it's Christmas or some holiday period like that. So those are, some grim realities can come up.
Those are awesome tips because, the newer sellers don't realize all this stuff's going to happen. They think, oh, they're quoting me 2 weeks. Yeah, it sounds great. Well, no, the supplier just wants your order, and it's really going to take 3 to 4 weeks. And I'd rather have an extra 1 to 2 weeks of inventory and have to take that into consideration than have a 1 to 2 week stock out, right?
Yeah.
So that's a very good point.
Sorry, you covered a lot of stuff in great detail, and it's like looking at the supply chain broken into its component parts. What can you do in terms of forecasting? Do you have any sort of magic to work out what the average difference is between a Chinese supplier saying how many weeks it is and how many it is in reality, or how do you deal with putting some reality on those?
Well, in terms of trying to figure out what's going to happen in reality, it's just going to come down to you and putting some pressure on them and saying, hey, I don't want to, I'm going to go with you. If you pick a supplier, it's just like any other type of communication, right? I'm going to go with you. I've chosen you guys as the supplier. I'm very happy with our communication so far, but I want to get a true grasp on how likely do you think it is that we're going to hit that 3 week mark? Should I account for an extra week in there? That's important. And they're all people too. And put them at ease to know that, yes, they got the order. So they're not going to sit there and kind of tell you what they think you want to hear. That's really all I can say. I mean, there is no magic formula because one supplier is one way and another supplier is a totally different way.
That's very honest. Yeah. Well, one thing I could say also is that you should probably put in a penalty clause for late delivery, so that once you should say to them, look, how serious are you about this? Because once we decided, my company's policy is that for every week late delivering, we're going to take 10% off the balance that we're going to deliver to you and so forth. And
they'll probably hum and haw about that, but that's definitely something that you see with more experienced sellers versus the newer sellers. If you're selling directly to Amazon and you ship a late delivery, you're sure that there's going to be what they call a chargeback, a supplier chargeback, and they're not going to pay as much of the invoice as they said they were going to pay. It is a little bit more difficult though when you are depending how your payment arrangement is. If you pay everything up front, then you can't go and take that back. If you're making a partial payment before shipment, then they can still hold back. It's not like it's an invoice, right? Where they've already shipped that inventory is in your hand. Now you can just either delay payment or pay a smaller amount. It's a balancing act, and I don't want to recommend that. It can be a slippery slope, but it definitely puts some incentive on their side to make sure that they ship that order on time to you.
Yeah, as you said, I think it's about trying to get some realistic figure out of them. And I think it's part of East Asian culture generally, certainly the Japanese are the same, that they rarely say no. So it's important to try and winkle out of them a realistic figure. And one way to make it realistic is to point out the possibility of bad things happening if it doesn't happen. Then suddenly, instead of saying, oh yeah, 2 weeks, they say, well, maybe allow 3 because they don't want a penalty. And that gives you a good flavor of what they're confident in delivering rather than what they want to sell to you. And I think, well, anyway, in my experience, that can actually really make a difference. Especially if you pay 30% down and then 70% balance, which I guess most of us would do for any significant size order.
Yeah, that sounds pretty typical, I think, standard. Everyone has different terms, especially as they get more experience and you're working with a supplier for a longer period of time, but 70/30 sounds somewhere around there.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that you asked the question about new products, right? And I brought up lead time, and then we kind of went down that track because lead time is a very important thing, and we want to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. But I want to make sure that we hit on, for new sellers, or excuse me, for new products, well, why does lead time matter? It's not lead time for your first initial order. You're thinking ahead to the next order. That's really what the key is, right? So I'm thinking, okay, I think I'm going to sell, when you're determining the number of orders that you want to, or excuse me, the number of units that you want to buy, I'm thinking, okay, well, if I place, if my order arrived, my very first order arrives today, my very first unit, and I have a 45-day lead time. Well, if I need to place it's your second order that you're thinking about. Because if I don't order enough units to cover 45 days, I cannot even place a PO today, the first day that they arrive, to get my next order in to prevent the stock out. Just to explain it a little bit better, I want to think ahead. So, all right, I don't want to place my next order for another 30 days. And then that order is going to arrive 45 days after that. So in my head, I'm thinking I need 75 days worth of inventory. That's why that matters. So that's why the lead time matters more, not as far as like, hey, I can test this new product really fast, I can get it in 2 weeks. It's not necessarily that reason. There are marketing reasons that you want to do that too, or cash flow. But the real reason that I care as an inventory manager is that I care about that second order. So am I setting myself up for success right from the start? I don't want to over purchase inventory, or at least I hope I don't. But at the same time, you don't want to under purchase. So I hear a lot of sellers saying, and you would probably know this better than I would, or just as well as I would. You hear a lot of sellers asking, well, how many should I order? I just order 100 units, or I just order 1,000 units. They're basically just making up a number. What I always recommend is, look at Jungle Scout and say, all right, I'm shooting for a rank of whatever it may be. I'm shooting for a rank of 10,000 in the office products category. And they'll give you an estimate of how many units, or how you can estimate how many units you think you're going to sell every day. And then in my example, I said 75 days, right? I want to place another order 30 days after this order arrives. So 75 days from now. So I'll take, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, so a simple formula would be the lead time plus, say, 30 days. So you got 30 days worth of data on which to base a reorder decision.
Exactly. We have a
nice.
We have a free Excel tool that we give out, and what we'll do is we'll set up a link. You can go to forecast.ly /amazing FBA.
Fantastic.
And what we'll do is we'll set that up so that everyone can get download that free tool. It's just a simple Excel spreadsheet. It does the calculations for you. So you say, all right, here's what your lead time is. Here's when you want to place your next order. And it should be helpful.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you. Yeah, that's very good. But I love rules of thumb, not because it absolves us of the responsibility to do the numbers and do the work, but because it gives you a quick decision-making tool. So, okay, so we need lead time plus 30 days is how long we need to, how much stock we need to order. That's a really great rule of thumb. That at least is a starting point that's based on something real rather than picking a figure out of the air, right? As you said.
Most definitely.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you.
I always, the last kind of piece on top of that is what's called safety stock. And I won't go into too much detail because safety stock can be a really complicated thing. But essentially what safety stock is it's insurance against a stock out. You're trying to predict an unpredictable event, right? So I'm thinking that I'm going to sell 10 a day for those 75 days. So we're going to buy 750 as our initial order. But you might want to, depending on your level of cash, bump that up a certain amount. So say, all right, I'm going to have a 10% safety stock or a 20% safety stock. So we'll use our 10% just as an example. I'm going to take 75 extra units in case sales are slightly more than expected.
Great.
So